Well, good afternoon. Welcome to China Town Hall. China Town Hall is an annual event organized by the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. My name is Max Lu. I'm a geography professor here at K-State. I'm also the director of the Confucius Institute, which is the local host of today's event. The Confucius Institute aims to promote the understanding of the Chinese language and culture. To that end, we offer Chinese language classes as well as sponsor various China-related activities such as today's event. It's great to see so many of you here, actually, at 4 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, let's say, with less than ideal kind of weather. So thank you very much. Well, as I said, the China Town Hall is an annual event. It provides Americans the opportunity to participate in a national conversation about issues in the U.S.-China relations and other China-related topics. This year, more than 100 locations across the United States and in Greater China are hosting the China Town Hall, similar to the one we are having here. And in fact, they are all happening at about the same time. There are 99 other locations in the United States and 3 in Greater China. Okay. And the K-State Confucius Institute is happy to be part of this national and really international programming. We are grateful to the support of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, which is located in New York City. Well, our event today consists of 2 parts. Okay. The first one is a lecture on China's birth control policy by acclaimed author and journalist Mei Fong. I will introduce her very shortly. And then at 5 p.m., 5 o'clock, we will tune in for a conversation on China featuring Condoleezza Rice, who I'm sure you all know is the 66th U.S. Secretary of State and also former National Security Advisor. And we will watch the conversation with her via live stream. And we should be done by 6 p.m. in case you're wondering how long the event will last. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Mei Fong. And Mei Fong has spent years documenting and analyzing the impact of China's birth control policy. In her 2016 book, One Child, The Story of China's Most Radical Experiment, Ms. Fong writes about the origins of the policy and some of its unintended consequences, including the creation of little emperors, the spoiled children in China, the huge gender imbalance, and a rapidly aging population. As a journalist, Mei Fong covered Hong Kong and China for the Wall Street Journal, winning a shared Pulitzer Prize for her stories on China's transformative process ahead of the 2008 Beijing Olympics. She is believed to be the first Malaysian to win the Pulitzer. And her stories on China's migrant workers also won a 2006 Human Rights Press Award from Amnesty International and the Hong Kong Correspondents Club. And she has also won awards from the Society of Publishers in Asia and the Society of Professional Journalists. After leaving China, she joined the faculty at the University of Southern California, Annenberg School of Communications. She is currently a fellow at New America, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. And the title of her talk today is Past and the Future of China's Birth Control Policy, Cause and Consequences of a Radical Social Experiment. And this is the first time Mei has been in Kansas. So let's give her a warm Kansas welcome.
Thanks, Max. Well, you know, as Max said, this is the Chinatown Hall. So all across America, there are classes and rooms full of people just like you sitting in listening to all aspects of U.S.-China relations. The whole thing is meant to design as a way to increase our understanding between, which is what is essentially one of the most important bilateral relations that China and the U.S. have. But I bet you're glad that you're not going to be sitting in on the trade talk right now, because this talk is going to be about, it's going to involve sex. It's going to involve violence. It's going to involve rockets. It's going to involve robots. So let me just start by talking about the policy itself and a little bit of shameless self-promotion. That was my book. I wrote it. And it's about the one-child policy, which is actually not a great name for the policy. Now, some of you may have heard, well, the one-child policy is over, it's ended, it's a two-child policy, it might be the three-child policy in the future, and then there's talk about dropping all restrictions. The truth of the matter is, this was never a very good name for the policy. It was used to describe basically a set of rules governing reproduction in China that started in 1980, 30-something years ago. And what many people may not realize is it wasn't strictly a one-child policy. Now, if any of you have ever been to China, you may have met Chinese people who've had 2, 3, 4 siblings. And you're like, what is this one-child policy? How come you have siblings? It's a big country. So what happened was there were exceptions made to the rule. So you could maybe have more than one child if you lived in the countryside and your first child is a girl, because they recognized that a lot of people wanted boys in the farm to do the farm work. That was one. You could also have more than one child if you worked in a sort of a dangerous profession. Say, for example, if you're a coal miner or if you're a fisherman. You might be able to have more than one child if you are one of China's ethnic minorities. Let's say if you're Tibetan, or if you live in Xinjiang and you're one of the Uyghur Muslims there, for example. So all in all, I mean, even before it was called, when it was still called the one-child policy, experts really said that it was maybe 1.5-child policy. But of course, nobody can wrap around their head around this idea of 1.5 child. What do? Slice off the top, slice off the bottom? So for better or worse, it became the one-child policy, the one-child rule, mainly applied strictly to only about a third of the population of China, strictly speaking, before it was changed to a two-child policy in 2016. But make no mistake, and there were places where you could skirt the rules. Maybe you pay a little bit under the counter. Maybe people would come over here and give birth and go back, or you could go down to Hong Kong, or there were ways to get around it, and people did, you know, as people do. And it also depended on where you live. So it's kind of like, if I say I explain to Americans, it's kind of like the tax code, which I know some of you are too young to pay taxes for, but it is very riddled with loopholes. It depends a lot on where you live and all these things. So it can be very, very complicated. So this was the policy, but make no mistake, it was meant as a way to reduce population growth in China. It was meant to stop China from being the most populous nation on earth. It was meant to allocate resources in such a way that the existing people would have more, so you didn't have to stand in line for days on end. If any of you have ever been to China, if you've ever taken a subway during rush hour, or tried to visit the Great Wall during like a festival week, you will feel it. There's a lot of people there. You'll be pushing on it. The one phrase you always hear in China is the words, 人太多. That means too many people. You hear, you're like, oh, you stand, oh, sorry, I stepped on your leg, sorry, 人太多. Or you're mashing in a subway, oh, 人太多. So this was it. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about something that's topical because, some of you might think it's on its way out. So why does it matter? Now, this story about this major climate report just came out, 2 days ago? Some of you may have seen it. It was carried by all the newspapers. And the whole idea is that global warming and the effects of global warming are going to be felt sooner than expected. And these will result in all sorts of catastrophes for coastal countries, or maybe even big weather changes or starvation, all these things. So the point I'm bringing this up with, one of the issues that we talk about when we talk about climate change is overpopulation, right? And this is one of the motivations and concerns for instigating or starting a policy in the first place. It was one of the ideas, but it wasn't the main idea. The main idea why China wanted a one-child policy was for economic reasons, primarily. They wanted to succeed. They wanted to grow economically very quickly after many, many years of living in civil war and many, many years of living under the Cultural Revolution and all the policies of the Great Leap Forward and the famine. They were in a very, very poor state 30, 40 years ago, and they wanted to grow. And they figured one of the ways to grow was to have a one-child policy. So that's pretty laudable in its own way, but some of the questions that we have, and I try to talk about it and will attempt to answer in the book, are some of the, was it necessary? I mean, was it effective? What were some of the consequences? How was it enforced? What was the history behind it? Who came up with this idea in the first place? And all these little emperors, if you have a single child household, that's a ton of kids with no siblings. What are they like? Are they all spoiled and selfish and entitled, or are they nervous wrecks? And some of these, okay, so I'll run through some of these. And so let's start with the first one. Was it necessary? So we all know right now that China is the most populous nation. Less than 10 years from now, there's going to be another country that's going to overtake that. Anyone want to take a guess? Which country? India, yes. And China is too happy to relinquish the crown. Okay, you take that most populous crown, you take it, we don't want it. But, I mean, one of the issues now, and remember when I came out with this book like 3-4 years ago, they had just announced a change to a two-child policy. And one of the reasons was because of all these perhaps unintended consequences, the one-child policy, which I'll sum up for you. It created a very imbalanced population, which in a nutshell was too male, too old, and too few very soon. So what I mean by that, so too male, for example. So I mentioned before, China is a very patriarchal society. They care about boys more. And it's not so surprising. I mean, if you go back and read Jane Austen or something, they cared about boys too. They handed down their land to boys. So this is a very strong root. So when this rule came about and people were restricted, people said, right, you can only have one kid. Then a lot of people said, well, then hell, I'm going to have a son because sons will inherit. I mean, there's a saying in China, I mean, raising a daughter is like watering somebody else's garden because, she's going to go marry out and go somewhere else. She's not going to be part of the family after she gets married. So sons are the good thing. So if you have to choose, they would choose sons. Now, that's not to say they wouldn't want daughters, but when you have a whole system of fines and punishments, when you break the rules and you only have limited choices, many people chose sons. So consequently, what we have now is a gender imbalance in China, the biggest in the world. Right now, there are about something like a surplus bachelor population of 30 million men, single men. Woohoo, girls! That's where you go. But there's 30 million surplus. I mean, it's hard to wrap your head around numbers. So what does 30 million sound like? 30 million is like the population of Canada or the population of Saudi Arabia. So just imagine a whole Canadian-sized population of single men running around. And so there are obviously all sorts of implications about that, right? Most sociological studies show that very male-centric societies are dangerous places. They're, more prone to war, more prone to crime, more prone to violence. And, we can talk about anything from prison populations to Arab Springs demographics, for example, that sort of show this. There's a whole wealth of evidence on that front. So one of the question marks is, with China's gender imbalance, How is it going to play out in the future? And that's one of the things I talk about in the book. Too old. What does that mean? You know, are Chinese people more old than other people? That's not true, right? So here's the thing. We are all living older now, right? Thanks to medical advances in medical technology. The average age, I think, for China to die, the average survival rate in China was about, you could probably live until 45 or 49 before World War II. Now this jumped up to 70-something. So obviously what this means is that the big cohort of people that were born in China, that big population boom that was imposed before the one-child policy, they're all living longer. In a way, that's a good thing. But the problem is the population to support that aging population, that has shrunk. Part of it is because of modernization. We all have smaller families. But part of it is also the one-child policy. So China has something like what we call a dependency ratio of about 5 working adults to support 1 retiree right now. Because there's a big cohort of people that are going to age out, that's going to switch to about 1.5 working adults to support 1 retiree in about 10, 15 years. So that's not great for demographics. That's not great for economy. Usually we look at places like Japan. One of the reasons that's cited as a reason for why the economy has slowed down and economic growth there is because they have the world's oldest population, the graying population. I mean, and just to give you an idea of how many, so by 2050, 1 in 4 Chinese will be a retiree. In absolute numbers alone, if all the senior citizens in China were to form their own nation, they would be the world's 3rd largest nation. You would have China, India, senior China. That's how it will go. So that's a lot of people, and that's a lot of, this will obviously affect things like pensions. They were talking about pension shortfalls. It will be a public health issue, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and all this kind of a drama will play it on a very individual level. Imagine if you're the only child and you have to take care of your parents and their aging and your grandparents, and you're the only one. You have no siblings to help you out. This is it. And this is in a situation for a country that has grown very rapidly, it's true, but whose social safety net hasn't evolved as much as, say, Europe's. So these are all potential problems down the line. That's too old, right? So we got too male, too old. And the next one is too few. What does that mean? How can you possibly have too few people in China? It's the world's most populous nation. The problem is birth rates have fallen in China very much. That's why they changed to a 2. They're changing it to a 3 probably soon. And at some point, they're already making noises about, they switched the policy now so that it's not a matter of don't have more children. It's now please have 1 more children. My joke is it's no longer the one-child policy. It's a please have 1 more child policy. Because when you have, and I think this is a thinking that has evolved also among nations. From 50 years ago, we used to think about population as mouths to feed. Now you realize you need population of a certain mix in order to make your economy grow. You need young workers, you need smart workers, and of course you can make them more productive workers if they're more highly educated. You would love to have, whole nations full of Silicon Valley type, smarties making all these things that will make your economy grow. But you also need a certain number to get it up there. And the problem is birth rates are falling and falling and falling. And part of it is in modern society that happens it's happening in Europe. It's happening in lots of parts of Asia. The only reason why it hasn't happened so much in America, although population growth has fallen here too, is because we have immigration to sort of back that up. So China is facing this, and that's part of what modern societies are facing. But on top of that, they also have the one-child policy, which means they've had 30+ years of propaganda telling people that having only 1 child is the best. And you cannot imagine how much that has sunk into the mindset. So even now, when they switch and they say, please have more children, birth rates are still continuing to fall. So these are some of the sort of broad outlines of where the consequences are. And you can sort of see this visually. This is the Chinese population pyramid in 1953. So what it shows you at the bottom is the base is the number of people at that age, 5, 10, 15, 20. And of course, it tapers off at the top because older people die off, so 70, 75. So this is what's considered like a sort of a normal population pyramid. And so you can see in 1982, it's sort of starting to change, right? The shape, you get this bulge in the middle of working class people. This is kind of what they call the demographic dividend that really comes to an own in the 1990s. This is what countries want to have, a big section of working adults relative to the non-working adults, which is to say the children and the retirees. This is what most economies want to have. But of course, at some point, there's payback. Right? So now it's no longer a population pyramid. It's more like a population diamond, you know? Look at it. So what we're seeing at the top now is people are living longer, and so you have this sort of overbalancing thing. So I'm just doing this visually just to give you an idea what this means and how scary that can be. Now, I think right now, I think the thinking has evolved a little bit with the understanding that some of these consequences can be bad, but this is a story from The Economist where they sort of talked about what were the best policies for the environment and if they rated it, and they talked about how the Montreal Protocol was number one, and that was the decision by most countries to reduce things that reduce the ozone layer, to stop producing the things to do it. And then they ranked their China's one-child policy as the fourth. But The Economist also kind of said, well, you know, we're kind of not super, we're only taking these numbers on the basis of what has been estimated by the Chinese government in terms of the actual number of births averted. Now, the Chinese Communist Party has argued that without the one-child policy, we would have 400 million more births today. Obviously, these has serious implications for the environment and so forth. Now, there's also been a lot of arguments by demographers here who said that, well, you know what, you kind of miscalculated that one. It's really more like maybe 100 to 200 births averted, maybe. But the difference is 100, 200 is still very significant, right? So we're still talking about somewhere between 100, 200, and 400. Say 100 is the population of America. So these are not small numbers we're talking about. But the question of whether or not the one-child policy was effective in terms of reducing the numbers, I would argue, is what people don't realize is that China actually had in place birth control policies or population control policies before the one-child policy. So before the one-child policy, they had several policies in place that, the last one before that was called the Later, Longer, and Fewer program. And the whole idea was to encourage people to marry later, space their kids longer apart, and have fewer kids, later, longer, fewer. And it was actually this period, which went on for about 10 years before the one-child policy, that family size fell from about average of 6 kids to 3. So this was actually the sharpest decline before the one-child policy. So you got to ask yourself, could they have continued to reduce population and reduce family size without going to the extreme? I mean, I sort of feel like the one-child policy in a way was sort of like napalm. You know, it was like throwing something very extreme. It was a very, very extreme policy to solve an issue. And with all these side effects, like the gender imbalance. And the question you have to ask yourself is, could they have done it in another way? Could they have done it easier? Okay, so I sort of outlined some of this stuff, but if I put all this in a book, if I put all the numbers in a book, and nobody would read it because it would be boring. I am a journalist, I write stories. I write the stories behind the numbers. So I wanted to write this book with all the stories of all the people who actually went through the one-child policy. So my story begins in Sichuan in 2008 during, anybody remember what happened in China during 2008? Olympics, right? Olympics, that's the one you all remember, right? But there was an earthquake, right? Also, right before that. It happened in center of China. And at that time, they had an 8.0 earthquake, which is massive. Over 70,000 people died. And I was in Beijing at that time, and I decided to follow a group of migrant workers back home to this place in Sichuan to where the earthquake's epicenter was. Now, the thing you may not realize about Sichuan area is a lot of the migrant workers in China that work in, say, the factories down south come from this area. This is a very populous area. So, like, for example, when I was covering the factory beat down south near Hong Kong, a lot of the workers were from Sichuan. And so the factory owners always learned you have to put Sichuanese food on the canteen food, otherwise they cannot attract the largest number of workers from Sichuan. So I decided to follow a group of migrant workers who had been construction workers, men and women, and they had been working in Beijing, and they were really worried about what happened, because when the earthquake happened, they didn't hear any news. All the lines were down, and they decided to go back home. So I found a group of workers at the railway station, because most migrant workers are too poor to fly, so they were looking to get back on a train, and we took the journey back there. And this would be like the distance of between, say, New York to Chicago. But because of the earthquake and because things had been torn up a lot, we ended up taking a train for a bit and hiking and walking and taking boats, motorcycles. And this is what happened. I'm gonna play you a short little video.
The earthquake in Sichuan had far-reaching implications across China. Large numbers of Sichuanese have spread across the country to work on construction sites and in factories as migrant laborers. This group is making the 800-mile return trek under the worst circumstances. They have no information about their loved ones. This is Liu Jishu. He and his wife, Tang Shuxiu, are migrant construction workers. They were working on luxury villas in Beijing when the earthquake struck. Their first thought was for their 15-year-old daughter, Hui Mei, whom they had left behind when they searched for jobs last year. Hui Mei lives in Wuyi, near the quake's epicenter. Since disaster struck, they haven't heard anything from their daughter. Getting home for the migrant workers was anything but easy. Most don't have the 300 or so US dollars for a flight, so they ride the rails. An uncomfortable 30-hour train ride southwest where you can sit or stand, but sleeping is hard to do, and at the end, the train only gets you partway there. Besides destroying homes and possessions and taking tens of thousands of lives, the quake also wiped out roads and rails, so the travelers were forced to go by boat, and later, by foot. They carried medicine, clothing, fruit, instant noodles, and other scarce items with them into the disaster zone. The travelers were anxious and had scant information on their loved ones. Tension sometimes ran understandably high. Liu Jishu and his wife felt more and more anxious as they neared Wuyi.
I'm printing out your...
Approaching the hill where their daughter's school was before the quake, Shuxiu was almost inconsolable. And then, their worst fears were realized. Hui Mei had died in the earthquake. Her name was on the list of those who would perish.
So you might be wondering, what has an earthquake got to do with the one-child policy? Well, one of the things I learned when I was reporting on this was that the area where the earthquake happened was actually a test ground for the one-child policy. So before they launched this program nationwide, they tested it in certain areas. They weren't sure that such a very restrictive program would work nationwide in implementation and so on. So they did it in this area. So one of the things that happened was when the earthquake happened 30-something years later, a lot of people not only lost their children, they lost their only child. And the first I heard about it was when I was interviewing parents, and I noticed in like maybe just 3-4 weeks after the earthquake, all these parents were going to the hospital. And I was like, why? And then I realized they were all going to the hospital to reverse the sterilizations they had had as part of the one-child policy. Because one of the things about a one-child policy is not just that one and you're done. In many places, they did require you to be sterilized as well. So, for example, this was a man, Zhu Jianming, and his wife, Mrs. Zhu, and they lost their 16-year-old daughter in an earthquake. And when I met him, he had just gone into the hospital to have a reverse vasectomy. He was 50 years old. His wife was 45. And they just sort of felt that not having a child in China was one of the most horrible things that could ever happen to them. And this is when you start hearing, the earthquake was when we started hearing the evolution. Okay, so the earthquake in China was when we started seeing the evolution of this word starting being used. When I know my Chinese friends are going to tell me I'm mispronouncing this, 是独生, yeah. So 是独, it means, it has a very special meaning. It means parents who've lost their only child in China. So there are about 1 million of these parents in China. Every year, about 75,000 of them join the ranks. Now, what does it mean when you are? I mean, one of the problems is for many people who lose their only child, it's not just your child you lost in a personal loss, it is also your pension plan. It is your savings for the future. So because especially if you're poor, there's no like big evolved social safety net. So when you lose your child, you're facing probable issues with support in the long term. And also, there are also Shidu parents who have difficulty buying funeral plots in cemeteries or getting admitted into nursing homes because people say, well, you know, you don't have any children to pay for your bills or authorize treatments or anything, so we prefer to admit parents who have children. So this is, I mean, the problem is China is still as very much a very, even though with the one-child policy, the family structure is very abbreviated. You know, it's father, mother, and one child in many cases. It's still a very traditional structure. Male, female, get married, have a kid. There's not a lot of the kind of evolutions of family we see here with, for example, gay families or single mom families. One issue is because single moms don't typically have children because it's very hard to get registration for China if you don't have for your child if you don't have a marriage certificate. So, so when I went to meet Mr. Zhu, he said to me, you know, that they live in a very small village, and he said that their neighbors were starting to shun them because they didn't have any children. And maybe they thought it was bad luck, or they thought that they would start borrowing or depending on leeching on their neighbors, but they just couldn't bear it. So even though he was 50 and she was 45, and they knew that the chances of having a child again by natural means would be very, very difficult, they felt like they really, really had to try. And the funny thing is, there's an odd little side story to it, which is probably not super related. But anyway, after I wrote the story in the Wall Street Journal, I actually had a letter from a doctor here in America. I think she was from the Midwest, but I don't think she was from Kansas. She had been very touched by the story, she said. And she had gone through IVF. She had several fertilized embryos. And she offered to give one of her fertilized embryos to this couple. She said, I don't know what it would be like for them to raise a little white kid in a Sichuan village, but I would like to offer them a chance. And there were many reasons why this didn't work, you know, and this didn't happen, but it was a very strange and generous offer, which I think sort of reflected the fact that people understand that there is some fundamental basic urge that people have to have children. Some people do. It's a very powerful urge, right, to be a parent. So that was one story. Now, the other story, this one, was when I profiled this lady because I wanted to try and understand what it was like to enforce the policy. You have such a strict policy, which is so intrusive, and it goes right into the bedroom. How did you get people to follow? How did you? And so this lady, her name is Gao Xiaoduan. She was an enforcer. She belonged to the Family Planning Commission in Fujian, which is a southern province. And she had testified before the U.S. Congress about what her work had involved. And she's now living in hiding. And so she explained to me, and I also spoke to many other members of the population police, and sort of, you know, how do you get this to work? And how do you get people to obey you and for something so intrusive? If I went to you and said, okay, you only have one kid, you got to get your sterilized, I mean, would you do it willingly? How do you get it to work? And so one of the things was there's a lot of them. So at one peak, there were like something like 85 million part-time workers. The Family Planning Commission unit had something like 2 million full-time. It's a vast machinery. And because China is so big, they realized that in order to make it work, they had to give every province a lot of discretion to manage the policies. So the problem was the rules then became very opaque. You just never knew, which of course meant that there was always a system ripe for corruption. So how do you make it work? Okay, one, system of punishments. You make it hurt. If you break the rules, you will hurt. So what does it mean? For example, if you worked in any kind of a government-related job, let's say if you were a teacher in a state school, and most schools in China were state-related, if you had more than one child, you could lose your job. You might even not be the person who broke the rule, but maybe you might be a relative of the person who broke the rule, and you could still run the risk of losing your job or having to pay a fine or suffer because some member of your family broke that rule. What else? You could have property destruction. So one of the population planning officials who worked in a small town, because, you can't find people if they don't have that much money. You can't make it hurt for them that way, right? Because if they're farmers, they don't have that much money. So what they do is they come to your house and they cause some property destruction. It has to hurt. So this guy told me, he said, well, we go there and we would, make holes in the ceiling, or we would just confiscate whatever they had. And usually it wasn't much. Sometimes it would just be, maize or grain or some homespun cloth. But the point was it had to hurt. We had to make an example. That was one way. And then, of course, this thing that came more and more evident over time, especially as China got more wealthy, was fines. These what they call a social 社会抚养费, it was social compensation fine. If you broke the rule for a child, for an extra child, could be anywhere from 2 to 10 times a multiple of your annual household income. So it can hurt. But of course, the family planning officials also had a lot of discretion. Obviously, there's a big difference between 2 times versus 10 times. So sometimes knowing the right people might get you a lighter fine. And then, of course, the ultimate, the worst kind of punishment was forced abortions and sterilizations, which also happened, and it happened as late as 2010, where in China there was a big story about a woman called Feng Jianmei, and she was pregnant with a second child. She had believed that she would be able to have a second child under one of these exemptions. But the authority said, no, you have to pay $6,000. They couldn't afford it. So she, like many other people who do in the same circumstances, played a game of hide and seek with the official, because the point was, as long as they don't catch you until you give birth, then, well, you're not exactly home free, but you got the baby. And even if they find you after that, you still have the baby. It's if they catch you before that, then they can take you away for a forced abortion and you have no baby. So she did that for a while until she was 7 months pregnant. And then they caught her. And they took her away and she had a forced abortion. Now, why do we know about this? It's because they had social media then. So what happened was, one of her relatives took a picture of her on the hospital bed, lying next to a 7-month fetus. That was it. And that, at 7 months, it looks like a baby, right? So this was something that really touched off a huge wave in China. Because I can tell you there are a lot of my Chinese friends, especially because I know mostly people who live in the cities, and they did not realize that this sort of thing was still happening. They thought, well, that was maybe 10, 15 years ago. Can't still be happening. But then that's when they realized that this kind of stuff was still going on. And then there was a big outcry, and I think this was one of the reasons that eventually led to the one-child policies ending. This was an end. And, the family planning officials who had to do all these things weren't necessarily untouched by this, I mean, I talked to many of them and said, how can you do this? When didn't you feel kind of unhappy about causing so much unhappiness? For example, Gao, she said that she had something like, by her own account, she said she convinced or persuaded maybe about 1,500 women to have abortions. Out of them, about a third were late-term abortions. And she's, I use the term persuaded loosely. She herself, though, had a second child. She adopted a son, and she kept it a secret. And she kept saying, I'm not a monster. I'm not a monster. I just had to do my job. It was my job. And one of the reasons why so many of them had to do it was this system called the 一票否决. It's called like a one-vote veto. And the idea was, if you were an official in China at some of these places, maintaining the birth quota was one of the most important things you could do. And it didn't matter, you didn't even have to be a family planning official. You could just be the person handling economics or town planning or something else. But if the birth quotas were not met, then you could be censured, you could lose your job, you could be fined. So these were very severe punishments that happened to them. And so that's why many of the family planning, the population police, as I called it, said that I had no choice. And I'm going to read you a part of what happened. Well, actually, I'll just tell it to you. So one of these men told me, he described the story. He said, so this happened when I was working as a young town official in a small town in Sichuan. And this was my first job. And when we knew that people were pregnant, we would sometimes, in hiding, we would sometimes try and catch them. So one time, my first nighttime raid, I led a team to this house. We knew that this woman was hiding out in the next village. So we surrounded the house, and it was at night. And we thought we were very quiet, but she must have heard something. She must have heard voices because she ran. She ran and ran, and we chased her. And she ran until she ran into the duck pond. And she ran in there until she stood up to the water, and it was up to here. And she stood there and she began to cry. She said she had to have this child. If she didn't have this child, her husband would never treat her right, and her mother-in-law would never treat her right. And she pleaded with me. And when he stood there, I could sort of see that image. It was still very fresh in his mind. It's like this woman standing in the dark in the pond, and all these people circling around the pond in the night, and her crying. And then I said, well, what happened? And, up until this time, he had been fairly sort of cheery, sort of like, oh, yeah, we did this, we did that. And then he sort of said, well, let's wait a moment here. And he said, well, I felt like I was doing wrong, but I had no choice. And I said, what happened to the woman? He said, well, we waded in and took her away. So that was the population police, and this is one of the stories I talked about to sort of explain how things worked. Now this one is an interesting one because this goes into the history. This man is Song Jian. He is considered one of the architects of the one-child policy, and he is a Russian-trained missile scientist. So you got to ask yourself, well, what have rocket scientists got to do with babies and population planning? And the answer has something to do with the Cultural Revolution. So right before the one-child policy in the 60s and 70s, there was the Cultural Revolution. And what happened was a lot of the intelligentsia, the academics, all those people who were critical, were punished. They suffered a lot. And so under Mao's directives. So as a result of that, there was very little academic opposition. Anybody who wanted to voice an opinion that was unpopular against what was the official line would suffer. The only group of scientists that were left untouched were the military scientists, which meant they were the only ones who had the resources and the confidence to propose something as drastic as the one-child policy. Deng Xiaoping, who was the leader at the time, said, I want to set a goal for China. We're so poor right now. I want us to achieve a goal of $1,000 GDP per capita by the year 2000. And so these guys all had the computers. Nobody else did back then. And they worked it back and they said, we cannot do this at a current 2-child per family household or 3-child. We need to all move to a 1-child family to achieve that economic goal. And that's what happened. So, so rocket scientists. And then you got to ask yourself at some point, how how could rocket scientists have known, I mean, they obviously did not factor in things like human behavior. The fact that, once you educate women and they go out of their household, they would start having naturally smaller family sizes, which shrink. They didn't factor that in. They didn't factor in things like advances in technology. So, okay, so maybe they can't be blamed for not being able to read the future, right? But they did approach it as a scientist, as machinists do. And one of the things that Song Jian said was, he said, yes, it could be a problem. I mean, it's not rocket science to figure out that if you reduce population at some point, you will have problems caring for the elderly, for example. So they knew kind of like this could be an issue. But what he thought was, and he wrote about it, was he thought that they could adjust the birth rate up when the time was necessary, that women could be persuaded or induced or whatever to have more children when the time came, So you want a bit fewer babies, down. You want more babies, up. And I think any woman around here will realize that human nature is not that way. It doesn't work so easy. So that was some of the history. And this is interesting because Song Jian was a protege of this guy. Anybody recognize this guy? Chen Xueshen. He was one of the founders of JPL, NASA's JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab at Caltech. So during the Joseph McCarthy communist Reds Under My Bed period in the 1950s to 60s, I want to say, he was put under house arrest and accused of being a spy. And so he got very disgusted with the US and moved to China, where he started their nuclear program and their rockets and missiles program. And he also went on to mentor people like Song Jian. So that kind of was a interesting sort of a link to the US there. This man was the opposite of Song Jian, I would call him. His name was Liang Zhongtang. And he is on the record as being one of the few academics who actually said, this one-child policy, super bad idea. Don't do it. I mean, very few, and you've got to realize that there was an unusually courageous act at a time because very few people dared say anything publicly. I'll give you an example. Beijing University, Peking University, the professor, the president there actually said 20 years ago that we should, before this, 30 years before the one-child policy, that we should reduce population. But at that time, that kind of a viewpoint was unpopular with Mao, because Mao thought at that point that we should have lots and lots of babies. This is how we will fight off the Soviets and be a strong nation. So he lost his job. So this man, Liang Zhongtang, was very courageous when he came out and said, no, it's a bad idea. And I call him China's Cassandra because a lot of the things he predicted came to pass, but nobody listened to him. But one of the things they did listen to him and the authorities was he was able to get the authorities to put out a series of secret two-child experimental zones. So before they had this two-child policy nationwide, they had these series of two-child zones, places where people were allowed to have two children with remarkably few restrictions. And not all of these areas were city areas. A lot of them were rural areas like this one here in Shanxi, which is, as you can see, this is a cave dwelling. A lot of people in that part of the world do. So it was a poor, and the thing is, so for about 25 years, they had these secret zones, which affected something like 8 million people. And what they found was with an easier set of population restrictions, they didn't have so many problems. They didn't have some of these consequences. The gender imbalance wasn't so marked. They didn't have so many problems with elder support issues. And that even given more leeway, a lot of people didn't want to have that second child. So birth rates were actually below national averages. So this was all a window into what China would be even before they launched the two-child policy. Okay, so my next exhibit, so to speak, oh boy, I'm in 42 minutes already, and we wanted to have all this time, and I actually have a lot more. Well, I'll finish off with this one then. So one of the big questions we have is, what does it mean for a nation of little emperors, singleton people, right? If you have a whole nation, well, not quite a whole nation, but let's say a whole full third, and most of it 90% in cities, where most children are only children, what does it mean for the psyche of the nation? How does this shape the nation? Are these children all risk averse or selfish, or what does this mean? So I portray this young man, Liu Ting, who is probably China's most famous little emperor because he won a medal for taking his mother to college with him. Would any of you take your mother to college with you? I think not, right? So why is this unusual? Because the thing was, China realizes they have a problem now with elder care issues. They're going to have so many old people, so they're going to have to revive, and not all of them can be taken care of institutionally, so they're going to have to sort of revive again the idea of what we call filial piety. That's a very Chinese word, you know. It means you owe your parents everything, you take care of them for the rest of their lives, and they take precedence over you and any children you might have. So, and during communist, the Cultural Revolution, some of this took a big blow because children were encouraged to tell on their parents and report them. And so with the one-child policy, they realized that this was going to be an issue, so they started reviving. They created a system of medals to recognize people who showed filial piety. He's one, Liu Ting. And then they also started instituting laws, which are probably very hard to implement. But there is, for example, a law in the books that allows children to sue their parents. Parents to sue their children if they don't support them. There's also another law that came into the books a few years ago that required children to visit their elderly parents once a year, which everybody sort of laughed at because, like, how are you going to enforce that? But these were all reflective of these concerns that they have. Now, the question of whether or not what this little emperor syndrome might... I looked at a lot of the social studies and data, and it's inconclusive. It's unclear. There are some studies that show that, well, they are no different from children with siblings. And then there's some children, yes, but they're good differences. And there's some that say, no, they're bad differences. The one study I found interesting because it measured cohorts, not singleton children against children with siblings, is that they measured a group born after 1980 against a group born before 1980, and they made them play games that would measure entrepreneurship, their generosity, risk-taking. And the conclusions were that the generation born after the one-child policy was more risk-averse, more pessimistic, and less generous. Now, that's just one study, and I'm sure there are probably a lot of single children who don't agree. But I would think that one thing that distinguishes, I think, the one-child generation in China is the tremendous pressure they feel as the only child, and because the pyramid is in shifting. The oldest of the one-child generation are not children anymore. They are people in their 30s and approaching 40s, which means their parents are in their 60s and 70s. We're starting to see that process where they're going to have to give back, take care of all these older parents and aging parents, what we call the 4-2-1 syndrome. 4 grandparents to, 2 of them in the middle of the sandwich and taking care of that one child. And so I would kind of argue that it creates a terrific sense of depression. And I'm going to just finish off by reading one thing, and then I'm going to open this to questions because I always enjoy that part the most. So I talk about how there was a book published about a series of letters from only children that had been sent to a talk show host. And what they showed was these children were mostly preoccupied with a sense of living under pressure, excessive parental love, and loneliness. Stress and pressure are a main theme. Children express embarrassment and guilt for the huge sacrifices that their parents made. One father offered to sell his blood for college fees. Another set of parents cooked beautiful feasts every weekend when their daughter returned home from school, but they lived on leftovers for the rest of the week. And one teenager recounted how his mother, before heading to work, would travel across town every day to his dorm room to bring him breakfast and make his bed. He said, before long, all my roommates were upset, and they would tease me, and they'll call me baby, just like my mother would do it. So it's kind of funny, but I guess the point I'm making is that some of these implications we're talking about the one-child policy, they haven't happened yet. What will happen with this generation as they deal with an aging population will be still happening. This big graying revolution we're talking about by 2050, it hasn't really happened yet. So some of these things are predictors. The other part, which we don't know for sure, is this gender imbalance. We know there are actual numbers out there. We know that this gender imbalance is resulting in some issues such as it's affecting housing prices in major cities because parents with sons will buy homes, will buy apartments to make their sons more attractive in the marriage market. We know that it has affected, for example, crime rates in some areas. So places with gender imbalances typically tend to have higher crime rates. There have been studies done on that. But some of it is also still speculation. For example, some academics have sort of said that a more male China is a more warlike China, which I don't think is very useful nor predictive. But also, there's also some theories that maybe China is going to be different. Maybe they'll have a lot of men and maybe they won't be violent. I mean, there's a lot of suggestions that they might be like Japan, where they have this thing called the herbivore men. So people turning inward, you know, just playing video games all the time, socially awkward, boys, just lots and lots of them. One thing it has resulted in, which I wrote about then, but I wrote about again, was an explosion in sex dolls. So China is now worried about a reduction in labor. So it is leading in AI and robotics technology. And one of the unexpected side effects of that with the gender population is a rise in the sales of sex dolls, which is one of the biggest things on Alibaba. And years ago, I was in a Chinese factory interviewing some of the earliest starters of this phenomena. And last year in Beijing, I mean, in China, they launched an app for a short while where you could rent a sex doll. It was called Tachu, and you could, you know, rent a sex doll for $60 for 3 hours. And it got shut down very quickly, actually. But, I mean, these are all reflections of a very interesting society that is very different from many other places because of some of these issues. But even aside from aberrations or, you know, extreme stories, which journalists kind of like, on a very real, very common basis, one of the things that evolves is huge marriage anxiety. You have only one child, huge exam anxiety. You have only one child, so much pressure on you, it's going to happen. So, you know, parents will camp out at their kids' school before they start school in college. You know, they're what they call tent cities. Your parents will move to make sure your kids are really settled in a dorm, and then they all have built all these tents for a while outside. During your major examinations, parents will take leave and not work for like a month or so just to prepare their kids for exams. Major companies like Baidu, which is like China's version of Google, they have singles clubs, 单身俱乐部, because a lot of their workers are single men, and they organize mixers for these guys. So dance classes, golf classes, anything for them to meet women. And what they do is they write all these up in a newsletter and they send it home to the parents. So the parents will be reassured that working at Baidu is a very good place for their sons or daughters for that matter. So I'm just throwing out some weird stuff at you right now, but I really like it if you would come back at me with some interesting questions. So let's open up that floor for questions. Anyone want to put their hand up? Don't be shy. I see a lady over there.
So what about twins? Does it just not matter about twins? So if they have twins, it...
Okay, so good question. And by the way, I myself have twins. But in China, twins are counted as a single live birth. So you are not paying a fine. And so the unexpected creation of this is, and I talk about it in the book, but I didn't have time to go into it, a lot of people will go to fertility clinics to do IVF, not because they're having infertile issues, but it's because they want to have multiples. That is one way to get around the heavy punishments for the one-child policy. And in one case, there was a woman who had 8 kids, both herself and 2 surrogates, and they called her the Babao Tai Muqin, you know, octomom, because there was speculation she was trying to get around the one-child policy by having 8 at all one go. It counts as one, right? But I think in the end she ended up having to pay a fine, and Yeah, but there are even cases of fake twins. So parents would try and register two children born very close together and say, well, they're twins. They're twins. Can't you see? See, he looks exactly the same as her, and they're born at the same time. So there was a Harvard study that found, like, in a cluster of villages, like a good 70% of all the twins registered were all fake twins. I mean, people try and get around these ways, especially if they feel that they're very onerous ways, right? But one of the big issues is, of course, now you have technology and you can create multiples, right? You have fertility technology. There are a lot of mainland Chinese people who come to America for fertility treatments. And some of it is because some of these treatments are not allowed in China. For example, surrogacy. So this is a big thriving business in China. Now, single women also want to freeze their eggs in China. That's not allowed under current laws. So they will come here and freeze their eggs. I mean, the idea is that they try and maintain a certain idea of a basic family unit. And so all these things. So for example, I talked to this guy who runs the surrogacy egg business between China and the States. And what it has done is driven up a demand for Asian students of Chinese ethnicity, eggs. So if you're a single Chinese person and you went to Stanford, for example, and they'll think your eggs are like super smart eggs, you can sell your eggs for $10,000 and pay for your college education each cycle. I'm serious. You know, this guy said I can get like we're so much demand. So some of them, they don't have enough demand, so they fly in people from Taiwan. So you have this weird situation where it used to be people used to go to China and adopt babies. So now you have a situation where you fly people in from China, donate the eggs to make the baby, which is born here and then flown back to China. So it's like a reverse cycle. Yeah, I know, it can really screw with your mind. Yeah, but I think I gave you more of an answer than you bargained for, but thanks. It's a good question. Any others?
What happened to the mothers and the children who were able to not get caught in hiding?
Well, in some cases, they would have the child and raise it, and sometimes they would have to pay a fine. Typically, the fines or things happen when they were trying to register the child for school and gain them some sort of recognition because they have to get back into the system, right? But in some cases, there were children who were not able to get registered, either because their parents were unable to pay their fines or unwilling to or couldn't or didn't want to. So there were something like 20 million of what they called the Heize, unregistered children under the black market, as a result of the one-child policy. And so I spoke to some, for example, there was a girl I talk about in the book, and she had never been to school because without the registration of papers, you can't go to school. She couldn't get a library card. She couldn't even buy a train ticket because you have to show ID. She couldn't get a job. So after the two-child policy was in, they talked about grandfathering these people into the system and giving them eventually the rights. But the problem is, for some of them, they've lost the best years of their life. You know, if you've never gone to school for, you're 20 or 30, congratulations, you go to school now. But you've missed 20 years of your schooling, your best learning years, maybe. So that's a problem. Yeah. Any other questions? Yep. Love your hair, by the way.
So, since there's so many males, did like the gay population go up? And since children are so necessary, are they able to like adopt some? I don't really know how that works.
Yeah. Good question. I don't know if the population actually went up, because here's the thing. I mean, I think that the gay population in China is what is, you don't go up, right? It's just that the recognition of being gay or coming out or all that happens. And certainly there's more awareness, and as in other parts of the world, that yes, there's a big, strong LGBTQ population there, but the official recognition for them and the rights they have, for example, that is still very backward. You can't get married if you're gay in China. It's not recognized. And so one of the problems is, if you can't get married, you can't adopt children, which is why a lot of them will come to America and do adoptions here or surrogacy or other stuff. They have to go out of the country for that, because there's still no official recognition. Because one of the reasons underlying the one-child policy and all the rigid rules is the belief in the sanctity of the family as a building block for maintaining social harmony, and family in the sense of it in a very traditional sense. Father, mother, kid. Yeah. Maybe 2 kids now. Yeah. Yep. The gentleman over there with the beard.
Okay, thank you. My job is there any immigration policy that, rule something related to immigrants? For example, a foreigner comes to China and decided to form a family there. It has a restriction with that law. And what happened with Chinese people who decided to study or work abroad and get children abroad?
Okay.
They can return to China.
Okay, so you're talking about, in some sense, is immigration, right? Some extent, outflow and inflow, because this is one of the questions that you have. If you can't grow your next grow population, can you import it? Which is kind of what America does to some extent, right? Can you attract? The problem is, in terms of people wanting to migrate to China, China is still not one of the countries that opens or welcomes immigration. It still has a very strong ethnic Han population. It's not a melting pot, so to speak. Perhaps that will be changed. One of the things they have talked about is creating a system that's very similar to India, where they sort of welcome back overseas Chinese and give them certain rights to live and work there. It's sort of like a green card kind of a thing. The joke is that to get what we call a red card in China, right, like a green card here, is very, very hard. There are especially a lot of African nations, and people want to work there and sort of get legal residency and permanent abode. Right now, that's not happening. Now, in terms of people coming here and studying and having more children, in the past, one of the issues used to be, if you came here for graduate school and you're from China and you had several kids, you didn't want to go back to China after that, right? Because what are you going to do? You don't want to pay the fines. And so China was suffering from a sort of a brain drain. But I think there was a period of time where they had a sort of a system in place that sort of allowed these people to come back with some sort of a forgiveness, policy, because they recognized that they wanted to welcome bad people. But then, of course, this sort of created a sort of a unequal, you're sort of saying that only the smart people can afford to go overseas to graduate school can have more children. You poor peasants, you're stuck, sort of like. So that was an issue. But now, of course, with this 2-child, 3-child, that's no longer such a big issue anymore. Yeah.
So I don't have a question, but I have a comment. So I actually agree with you that there are many unintended consequences of this one-child policy. But at the same time, I would like to see some positive, like the benefits of this policy, because it's like a negative, impact is one side of the story and the benefits another side of the story. If you just focus on the negative side, that could give us a biased impression of this policy. So I would like to, maybe you write that in the book. I don't know.
I do talk about it. Obviously, I look at it in a way of looking at it from the economics perspective. So one of the big questions people associate or assume is that China would not have gotten so wealthy or shot up the GDP if not for the one-child policy. The problem is, it's actually divorced the two of them because, and I talked to a lot of economists about this, the main reasons for China's double-digit GDP growth in the last 30 years is primarily because of other policies, such as, reforming the state-owned enterprises so that they were much more encouraging FDI. So Arthur Krobler, who's one of the most well-known economists on Chinese economy, he said, look, if China grew 10%, I would be surprised if the one-child policy was more than 0.1% of that. However, I would say the one-child policy probably benefited one group very much, and I would say that's the group that's studying here, right? Because most of the Chinese students who are studying in America are beneficiaries of the one-child policy, right? If you had 5 siblings, the chances of your parents being able to afford to send you to an expensive education overseas, not so much, right? So that's, and then especially for girls, for women, if you were born after 1980 in a city in China, your chances of being well-fed, educated, it's the best time ever for women in China after that period. Why? Because you don't have siblings, especially because women usually get the second treatment, right? Now you don't have any brothers to compete with, so your parents will educate you as if you were a boy. They'll send you to Harvard, that kind of thing. So you guys are the best beneficiaries of that policy. But of course, the flip side is eventually, at some point, you're going to have to take care of all your aging population and all that. That is something that is coming. So, you know, how that's weathered, whether you find innovative ways is something that your generation will be showing us. So I obviously like to see that and see how it manifests itself. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Well, thank you.